Okay, thank you everyone for joining. We're going to get started now. Don't forget, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. And now I'm going to pass it over to Clayton.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Yeah, this is Clayton Rines with Tevora. I am principal consultant here, and I really oversee our technical delivery practice areas that we do have, all the incident response, cloud security, security solutions, and what we're talking about today, which is our threat services, all of the penetration testing that we do. Joined here today with Manfred on our team, who's really our lead for Adversary Simulation. And the key reason why we wanted to put this out there today is we have a lot of folks that do pen testing and penetration testing on the regular and full stack testing, a lot of application stuff, a lot of network testing, but what's often overlooked is that full adversary simulation and getting to a point where you're really replicating what an actual threat actor would do against your particular environment. Manfred's going to go through some of that and kind of share some details around current attack techniques, and hopefully it's good context for you to understand what's possible and what testing possibilities do exist in this area on this very viable attack vector. So I'll turn it over to Manfred. We'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Clayton. Hi, my name's Manfred, and I'll just go through some of the talking points. So what is adversary simulation? It's really a more comprehensive approach to testing an organization's security posture compared to regular penetration testing. And here are a few reasons for the distinctions. There are realistic threat scenarios. Adversary simulations involve simulating realistic attack scenarios that are tailored to an organization's specific security architecture, their threat landscape, and business operations. So this would allow a security team to identify the gap in their defense against real-world attacks. It's comprehensive testing, so it's not just testing technical controls, but also human processes, the policies, procedures, how they're implemented, and it evaluates the effectiveness of an organization's overall security program in detecting and responding to attacks. It also offers an area for continuous improvement because it provides a roadmap for this improvement by identifying vulnerabilities and weaknesses in an organization's security posture. It enables security teams to prioritize and remediate vulnerabilities based on their potential impact to the organization. And then lastly, it reduces that business impact and really helps organizations minimize the potential impact of a breach by identifying and mitigating vulnerability before they can be exploited. So overall, while regular pen testing is useful for identifying technical vulnerabilities in an organization's security infrastructure, adversary simulation provides a more comprehensive and realistic approach to testing an organization's overall security posture. So I can't stress this enough. Attackers are constantly chaining together attack chains, and a lot of these individual findings and weaknesses of an organization is really holistically observable through just performing individual pen tests. And what adversary simulation services can do is it can provide you an insight into an organization's security posture and help prevent successful, nation state attacks like APT. And then the second thing that I want to talk about is traditional and modern social engineering technique and tactics and why it's relevant in adversary simulation and why it's relevant today. So we know that social engineering isn't anything new. It's 2023. So why are we talking about it? Because it's not only that it's just happening, but it's also adapting to the modern defenses. There also seems to be this misconception that social engineering isn't technical or valuable because it's so common. Everyone just assumes that it happens and someone's going to follow it. But as technical security implementations evolve, so do adversary techniques and tactics. And we're constantly evolving with the atmosphere and combining newer attacks with modern social engineering techniques. So in fact, as tools and environments are starting to have less room for subversion, right? Technical security control, social engineering starts to be the only practical way for an attacker to approach. So I want to share some of the newer techniques, which will hopefully offer insight as to why it's increasingly important to consider adversary simulation service offerings. In reality, many of the high-profile breaches in 2022, so pretty recently, have involved social engineering for initial foothold and lateral movement. So think about Okta, Uber, Rockstar Games. So the next couple of slides, I'll talk about traditionally boring phishing campaigns, techniques and tactics, and then provide you context on where that impact really is, and then gradually ramp up to an attacker's methodology and newer methods. So we start with external reconnaissance. So let's briefly talk about why that's important and why and what it is, right? So we perform and attackers perform external reconnaissance against a company in order to gather that information about the network system personnel. This information then can be used to identify vulnerabilities, if they're lucky, and weaknesses that can be exploited in an attack. But here are some common techniques that attackers use to perform external reconnaissance. So open source intelligence, right? We all pretty much know what that is. I'm going to assume that you do, but if you don't, basically attackers can gather information about a company from publicly available sources like social media, job postings, online directories. They might be looking for vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, right? But just from here, realize that an attacker can conclude several pieces of information that they can already harvest or start their attack from. They can start messaging recruiters from LinkedIn. They can start getting phone numbers and emails. I have in the past successfully performed an adversary simulation just by sending a recruiter a malicious payload and then being able to access the internal environment that way. Called the recruiter up, not as a candidate, but because I had his phone number, I could wait a couple of hours, and then I called him up as an internal IT employee that I impersonated, requested his password, username, and then also convinced him to execute a payload while I was on the phone with him. Now, this was largely due to just leveraging LinkedIn, but what about email solutions that companies should have had to prevent that payload from even being delivered? So we can talk more about that later, right? And then, some of the other things like port scanning, service enumeration, these are just low-hanging fruit. So attackers might use Nmap or another scanner to identify any open ports and services on the company's network, which can help them identify those low-hanging fruits, right? Like if they see an MS-17, or what if they see like an RDP, right? That's something that they can, an RDP server, they can either target that, or once they have credentials, they can directly go to that machine and they don't really need to do anything else, and they can, that's their way in essentially. So not only just finding vulnerabilities, even if there was no vulnerability, it can help an attacker have an idea of where those sensitive information is or where those sensitive systems are when they're performing that port scanning and other profiling activities, right? So the associations too are important, right? Like, what does this company do? Who are their associates? Who do they work for? Who do they work with, right? This allows an attacker to answer these questions, usually just by browsing the organization's site and leveraging other data sources to find potential entities to impersonate or web portals to clone for a phishing campaign. This also helps an adversary make the right decision when they're purchasing a domain for phishing. Physical reconnaissance. Attackers may conduct physical location reconnaissance, watch for foot traffic to see how to infiltrate from a physical perspective. If there are events that a company is hosting for, say, vendors and third parties, there's going to be a lot of ambiguity and allow an attacker to venture into the physical location. So in a past engagement, we saw that employees' badges were visible, which led us to both being able to clone said badge and even take it right off of them because it was placed somewhere that was insecure. So more importantly, for adversary simulation, the reconnaissance isn't just a standalone effort that maps out the attack. Sometimes it's really where the attack starts, because whenever there's an opportunity that presents itself, an attacker will take it, and so do we. So sometimes, like I said, the external reconnaissance doesn't necessarily yield a large attack surface, but it will always provide a blueprint for an attacker to follow, and that's usually where it starts. So social engineering is the most common vector because an attacker can be non-attributable. Even if their activities are detected when targeting an employee or an environment, they can continue social engineering as long as they remain non-attributable. They can play the persistence in the APT, Advanced Persistent Threat part. And I think a lot of people say, who's going to target me? I'm just a small shop. Well, here's an example. My friend works at a company with less than 40 employees. Every time there's a new hire, their new hires get a phishing email on day one asking for Amazon gift cards from the CEO. Does that sound familiar? Because it happens to us too. Because how does an attacker know if someone's new? Because they're persistent. They're keeping an eye on LinkedIn when people are publishing where they work and when they started. Fresh employees make great targets because they haven't gone through security training. And then the trend of exploiting human nature is virtually impossible to stop. We can't just install an EDR onto someone and expect that they won't be vulnerable or will call something out when they see it. So there's a way larger margin of success when attackers target humans. So just bear with me here about phishing. I know everyone knows what phishing is, but it still seems that I can never get a 0% credential submission rate. So what's the impact? Phishing is very common tactic used by attackers to gain access to sensitive information or systems. An attacker will often buy expired domains, and then they send out blasts. Ransomware groups do this as well. So they're really banking on low quality security implementations and not a mature environment. But maybe you have a great email solutions that makes you think you're not vulnerable. And if you think about what phishing really is, you should know that no email solution is really just a false sense of security, right? When I perform our penetration testing, just to perform the phishing exercises, our clients are whitelisting our address space just so we can test user awareness. But with a decent infrastructure and some weeks of time, we can bypass all those email solutions without whitelisting. So whitelisting is really just to save us time, and it's really just to test the user awareness aspect. So there's that low effort phishing, and then there's targeted phishing. And I'm not talking about spear phishing a few people, like targeted phishing, targeting security controls. We've had SOC teams tell us we knew it was a phishing email because of how sophisticated and well crafted the email was. So know that when advanced persistent threats like APTs are targeting US companies, it's usually from another country where English is not their first or primary language. So we might laugh off the very obvious indicators of compromise in an email, but if the attacker takes this into account, there's really nothing to laugh at, right? Because in an adversary simulation, the impact of a successful phishing attack can be very significant. If an adversary simulation includes a successful phishing attack, that attacker is going to be able to gain access to sensitive information, login credentials, financial data, and really anything else that would be proprietary. And from an attacker's point of view, this could lead, right, to data breaches, financial losses, and other security incidences if it was a real attacker. And in addition, a successful phishing attack could provide attackers with a foothold in an organization's network, allowing them to move laterally and potentially gain access to other systems or data. This could result in a more widespread security incident and have a greater impact on the organization. So by simulating that realistic attack, organizations can evaluate how they respond and identify areas for improvement, either it be employee training or technical controls. So let's talk about phishing as a service. This is not something people talk about a lot. So this is what an attacker might use, right? We have a phishing service and now it's available for everyone. Phishing as a service is a type of criminal service offered online where attackers can purchase pre-made phishing kits and services to launch phishing attacks. It's generally a subscription service with a lot of great features that we also do. Reverse proxy and cookie injection to bypass multi-factor authentication. It's got customizable templates, right? And it provides those templates that can be tailored to look like legitimate emails from well-known companies, banks, social media platforms, or e-commerce sites. So gone are your low-quality phishing, spam type of emails. These are legitimate emails created for the target audience organizations. They can have template-less emails. We can have targeted campaigns against specific individuals, organizations, using the information gathered from social engineering or other reconnaissance activities, like I was talking about earlier. It can be used as a delivery method. So we can deliver phishing emails through various methods, right? As an email, as a text, use different social engineering tactics to encourage the target to click on a malicious link or open a malicious attachment. And then we, as well as phishing as a service, they also provide reporting and analytics to their clients, as we do for our clients, and that would include information on success rate of the phishing campaigns and the type of credentials or data obtained. So that's kind of just like logging. And now they've also offered infrastructure and hosting services, right? So web hosting, email servers, just to support that phishing campaign. So they'll have, I think the coolest part about this is the reverse proxy and the cookie injection to bypass 2FA. So let's go over this diagram really quick. The user puts their password into the phishing site, right? Then that site proxies the request to the actual site. The site then returns that MFA screen. That site is then proxied to the user via the phishing site. The user inputs the MFA token. That phishing site then proxies the request back to the actual website, and then there's a redirect. And he closes the loop, and now the person has a session cookie and can inject it directly into the browser, and they'll have that session. So that should be pretty concerning in our world because it lets an attacker easily and quickly launch a targeted phishing campaign without even needing the technical skills or resources to do anything, right? They didn't need to make the template. They didn't need to set up the infrastructure. They don't have to set up the logging, delivery methods. Pretty much taken care of. Targeted campaigns are taken care of really through phishing as a service. So they just pay a monthly subscription fee and they can get all of this done. So it's not like, okay, an adversary needs to really be sponsored by a nation state where they have funding to do this. If an attacker can do this, just expect that they will. So this is the phishing solutions. We're talking about bypassing phishing solutions. They're designed to detect and prevent phishing attacks by identifying and blocking malicious links and emails. And obviously, attackers are constantly developing new techniques to bypass these solutions. And here are some ways that they can. So let's take Proofpoint, Mimecast, the two most common email solutions I come across, and fairly advanced as well. So rewriting URLs, right? So an attacker can send a phishing email with no URL in the phishing body, and then, right, they put that in an attachment, and then they have bypassed the URL rewrite, right? What about scanners? Public scanners can crawl infrastructure and deem a site as phishing, but an attacker can set an Nginx rule to block crawlers and only allow authorized users to access it, right? If they have a fresh domain that's blocked, they can age that domain, just give it some time. If it's blacklisted by some public security tool, they can actually just request a whitelist and it'll go through in a couple of days. So within 48 to 72 hours. Indicators in public tools, let's say they don't buy phishing for a service, they want to set it up manually. And phishing kits, they're not going to have indicators of compromise. But if they're using a public tool that's accessible, it can still be manually removed, right? So this is also another type of phishing that's really not talked about, and it's not even trained about. This is browser and browser phishing, and it's a type of phishing attack that targets web browsers extensions or plugins rather than the browser itself, right? So in a browser and browser phishing attack, the attacker creates a fake login page or other malicious content that's displayed within a legitimate browser extension, such as password manager and ad blocker. And the goal is to really obviously just collect credentials, trick them into entering their login credentials or any other sensitive information where the attacker can capture and use for malicious purposes. But this is really hard to detect, right? Because if you look at this URL, this is usually where your training is. This URL is pretty much the same as this. This is facebook.com, this is facebook.com, because it's not targeting the website, it's targeting extension. And really how you would detect this is, you would scroll, and if it doesn't scroll, for instance, then you could tell that it's phishing. But like I said, it's very hard to discern in the screenshot. And if you sent this to me and I didn't know about this, I would probably log in. So of course, there's some recommendations that we can talk about just to detect on this, but we'll just skip to this first. And then if there are questions on how to detect stuff like that, we can talk about that later. So this is a 2FA bypass and phone pretexting. So attackers can use social engineering techniques to bypass 2FA by manipulating the user into providing their second authentication factor or convincing them to disable it, right? So this is not like your email phishing, like we've stolen your token. This is using more social engineering to do it. So attackers may, and this is usually what they do, they'll impersonate a trusted entity, and that could be a service provider or IT support, and request that the user provide their second authentication factor token. And this can be done, like I said, this can be done through phishing emails where you're just stealing that whole session, or it could be done in a phishing email where you're just asking for it, or a phone call where you're just asking for it. And that can be appearing to be legitimate. And I've done this many times, and it's scary how easy it is to get the 2FA token. A lot of people won't give me the password, but the 2FA token, people always give up. I've actually even done the opposite, where I pretend to be the end user and had security personnel, after being escalated from the help desk, reset a password for me. And most of the time after this initial compromise, it becomes very easy to use the phone pretext to call an attacker and then provide them with 2FA code. And then after they've done that, I can add, say, like a burner number as part of the 2FA. So now I have persistence in that 2FA, and I can authenticate without changing the password and have access on the internal network, right? There's other scenarios. Attackers can use social engineering tactics for the user to feel a false sense of security by sending them a phishing email that appears to be from the user's bank or another trusted source, and instructing the user to provide a second authentication factor as part of their security check. The way attackers do it, right? Technical support scams. I'm sure most people have received the call. Attackers may pose as like a technical support staff and request the user's 2FA factor to fix the problem with their account, and they can also convince the user to install malware or remote access tools that'll allow the attacker to access the user's device and then disable 2FA. But also want to keep that in mind that installing malware basically subverts the need to bypass 2FA. Most malware in C2 are capable of proxying internal traffic for an attacker, so they can move laterally without any more roadblocks because they're technically already on the internal network. So unless you have internal network necessitates that 2FA, they're most likely going to have subverted that. And then this is actually really cool. I wanted to show this on a demo, but if on LinkedIn, I've basically posted this as a SoundCloud demonstration on voice cloning in real time. So up until this point, I've been doing a lot of research. It's been very difficult to even change my voice to like an opposite gender when I'm doing voice cloning, but I will send this link to everyone that is here, and you can see how easily and how real it sounds that I can clone anyone's voice, and it only takes about 5 seconds, and you can switch between voices seamlessly. So you can switch from a male voice to a female voice. It also captures accent, intonation, and everything else. And I also have a tutorial on how to do it. So I think that'll be very interesting for someone who wants to play around with it. But there's 2 parts of that series. I'll link it later, but that is going to open up a new vector of attack for attackers as AI becomes, generative AI becomes more and more relevant. It's definitely going to be something that people abuse a lot of, because if you've ever called a smaller company or you have a smaller company, people know who you are. But if you clone that voice and you're calling, people aren't going to say, well, you don't sound like Sam, for instance. I'm just throwing a name out there. But like they're going to say, okay, well, this actually sounds legitimate. So think about how large this attack surface just became just with these things, right? And there's still things that I accidentally opened the SoundCloud link on my browser. Did not mean to do that. I meant to go to the next slide. Here we are. Okay. So abusing third-party services. This is really talking about what we can't do, but attackers can. So like I said, this is already a huge, back in the day, like services like Skype, Omegle, Xbox, even Minecraft, it used to leak IPs, right? So with Minecraft, it wasn't really like inherent flaw, but people could just host their own servers, which would then force an IP disclosure if you want people to connect to it. So that's literally just how it needed to be for other people to access it. But that's digressing. I didn't really play Minecraft. I just wanted to list it here because this is how attackers used to do it. So with services like this, attackers can call up an ISP and impersonate the internal employees like the way I just described for personal information disclosure, right? So let's take a look at this perspective. If I'm able to social engineer a company credential logon for an employee of a company, what is to stop an attacker from getting support agents to disclose information that isn't theirs, like client information, right? So this is a vector that adversaries abuse to cause real damage, like identity theft, different forms of fraud, and unfortunately swatting. This is where it originated from, was being able to pull doxes through social engineering. And there are mechanisms then, and there are mechanisms now for things like the in-person verification methodology, which will prevent any account changes unless you're there in person. So the agent will put a note. But if you've caught up with everything I've been saying so far, persistent social engineer will and can and have subvert this measure, right? They're just going to play agent roulette until one person is going to disclose that information. So physical penetration testing is extra unique in the sphere because even less people think this is necessary, even less people think it's a problem. Full scope holistic adversary simulation means full scope and all inclusive. What that doesn't mean is leave out a tech vector that might otherwise lead to successful infiltration. So as soon as we start cutting out certain parts of an adversary simulation or a red team, it's no longer an adversary simulation because we're no longer simulating an adversary. We're performing a penetration test of different environments and we're missing the objective of the adversary simulation. When you're performing an attack, whether they're successful or not, this is not the other part of red teaming or adversary simulation. There's a huge focus on non-attribution and covert activities. Physical penetration tests both force these factors and it also tests a hypothetical insider threat, right? It actually requires a great deal of expertise in camera system, door hardware, lock picking, alarm system, surveillance, disguises, and real-time social engineering in person. And it doesn't always mean infiltration, but infiltration does unveil a whole new breadth of issues within the physical space, like unlocked workstations, like vulnerable keyboards, like unguarded bins, sensitive information, exfiltration. But during our red teams, being in physical proximity means that we can try a couple of subtle hacks and attack paths, such as wireless hacking or maybe installing a NUC or a PI near the physical facility. USB drops are not physical penetration tests, but can be incorporated as part of them, right? In this age, I highly doubt that people would simply plug in and play a rogue USB, but who knows what someone might do when you label USB as 2023 salary. If delivery of a payload is an issue, physical access can really contribute to a successful red team. I've installed payloads for red teams, and even when I eventually got caught, the operators with access to the C2 had already achieved persistence and eventually domain administrator, even though I was burnt. So we'll also have a blog post that outlines physical penetration testing methodology on our threat blog with the voice cloning and that demo. So that's something I can send out later. So the reason adversary simulation is important is because I see a lot of firms and engagements move to an assumed breach position nowadays, and I think that's detrimental to the industry and will only hurt companies in the long run. Certainly, there's value in an assumed breach and a purple team, but many times this motivates operators to not try as hard to get in for an initial foothold. So what happens when you skip that part and you think, wow, my external perimeter is really strong, no one's going to hack it, and then over time you let the internal security posture slide because you consider your external scope to be either unhackable or low risk, and then someone gets in from the external environment, right? That assumed breach is a very effective way to detect and respond to potential security threats, but it isn't as holistic as a red team approach, which can help you identify and address potential security gaps across the entire security infrastructure. There was a tweet I saw and it resonated with me where someone said, why not just put your vendors in the core banking system? They were targeting a bank, I'm guessing. And yes, that demonstrates the worst of the worst, right? You're getting that objective of that crown jewels, but it also points out a lot of steps on how to get to the crown jewels, and that's all skipped. So initial foothold is actually extremely difficult to achieve, which is why it makes sense to have a budget dedicated to experts and professionals to perform what is extremely difficult to achieve. And the best way to learn isn't from your weaknesses, but other people's weaknesses, right? So if we've seen other high-profile hacks, we want to be able to prevent that. And since we study the methodology of how they get hacked and that attack narrative, my strongest recommendation is to invest in adversary simulations. Compensating controls are great, but nothing will really be having an adversary simulation and then mapping that attack path out, because once someone gets in, we can describe to you, we can let you know all the contextual and situational and environmental factors that played into the success of infiltration. So now I can open it up to Q&A. If there are any questions.
It looks like there was one question in the chat. It was, what is a vulnerable keyboard?
Vulnerable keyboard are like wireless keyboards that Logitech, Microsoft, Amazon had for a while there. And those vulnerable keyboards were wireless keyboards, and there was a project that allowed injection of wireless keyboards. So you can inject into these wireless keyboards to either you can inject keystrokes or you can keylog. And what's really dangerous about injecting keystrokes is somebody else can just inject a keystroke, say like a PowerShell command, and have that download a payload and execute it in real time on the fly with someone else's keyboard. So if someone was unattended, they're already authenticated in their system, we can just run the remote code execution and it will basically just run it on their keyboard, emulate keystrokes. Additionally, key logging, we'll get master passwords if you're using a password manager. All that stuff just becomes basically useless when we have that kind of information.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was all the questions that there were. Thank you everyone so much for attending the webinar. We will have this live on our website, and someone will also reach out to you after this to send over the slides. Okay, bye. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.